Welcome back to Hinduism. In this video, we're going to look at the relation between Hinduism and the fine arts. In a religious context, iconography refers to a pattern of imagery used to represent a god, spirit, or a holy person such as a saint. The origins of Hindu iconography may lie in part with the Indus Valley civilization. This is disputed by modern scholars in part because of the long gap between the end of the Indus Valley civilization and the earliest examples of Hindu icons. The Indus Valley civilization ended by around about 1700 BCE, and so there was 1,000 years or more between that and the earliest examples of Hindu icons we can see, which are after 700 BCE. An example of Indus Valley civilization iconography can be found on the Indus Valley seals. These are small stone seals that contain carvings that could be used to press into clay or another soft medium. A famous example is the so-called Pashupati seal. This seal is named after Pashupati, which is a name or epithet of Shiva, which means Lord of Animals. Shiva is often associated with wild animals, like the ones you can see depicted on this seal. There's a buffalo, for example, and looks like a tiger. We don't know if this seal is depicting Shiva or a god related to Shiva. But in addition to the animals, there's some other similar iconography. The figure is wearing a horned headdress, and the form of this headdress with the two horns on the side and the prominent central element form 3 points, and that's similar to the Triskula or trident, which is used as a symbol of Shiva today. Also, you'll notice that the figure has some stripes on his torso and arms, and these may represent the stripes of a tiger skin or other animal skin. You can see what looks like a tiger to the right of the seated figure, and the stripe pattern is similar to that on the garments being worn by the seated figure. Another interesting aspect of this icon is that it could be depicting a being with 3 heads. You can see, in addition to the central face, there's what look like a nose and lips protruding from each side. And indeed, there is a form of Shiva that's depicted with 3 heads in later Hinduism. So it's definitely possible that this type of imagery influenced the iconography of Shiva. It is still disputed, though, whether in fact this happened. In part, this is because we cannot decipher the script of the Indus Valley civilization, so we can't be sure which being or which type of being this seal depicts. Early examples of Hindu iconography can be found in the Maurya period, which corresponds to the Maurya Empire, which lasted from around 322 to 185 BCE. An example is the sculptures depicting yakshas or spirits that you can see on the right. Those are from Patna, an important city of the Mauryas from the 3rd century BCE. We can also find terracotta figurines of gods and goddesses from this period. These were often small, different from the larger sculptures found in Hindu temples of a later period. And not all of these are clearly religious, but some of them may have been depictions of gods or goddesses. You can also see in the picture on the left of a serpent of multiple heads and the hoods of these, the cobra-like hoods of these serpents. This is a type of imagery used in a lot of later Indian religious art, not only in Hinduism, but also in Jainism and Buddhism, to represent a Naga or serpent spirit who would often be hovering over and protecting a god like Vishnu or a liberated saint like the Buddha or Jaina Mahavira. After the Maurya Empire, we see the beginnings of temple art in South India. South Indian architecture of temples and other art like sculptures were very influential on Hinduism as a whole. And it may have been influenced by the earlier art we can see from North India, such as that of the Mauryas and some of the other kingdoms, but it really took on a life and iconographical tradition of its own that then influenced Hinduism as a whole. Another important influence on Hindu iconography was that of Greek-speaking Buddhist kingdoms of northern and northwest India. Their art style is called Greco-Buddhist. Examples include the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, which lasted from 250 to 130 BCE, and the Indo-Greek kingdom, which lasted from 180 to 10 BCE. There was also a later kingdom, the Kushan Empire, which lasted from around 30 to 375 CE. The founders of this empire, the Kushans, were not ethnically Greek, but their art was influenced by the Greek-influenced sculpture of the earlier dynasties of northern and northwestern India. Those dynasties were founded by successors of Alexander the Great. By the first few centuries CE, the Greeks were basically out of India, but they seem to have had a lasting influence on some of the iconography. Even though this was Buddhist, not Hindu iconography, there was often mutual influence between the religions. One reason for this is that sculptors or craftsmen could be hired by patrons of multiple religions. And so sometimes iconography they would use from one religion would slip into another that way. An example of Greco-Buddhist iconography is the Gandhara Buddhas. Those come from the ancient kingdom of Gandhara in north or northwest India, what's now Afghanistan. These show an influence of ancient Greek depictions of the god Apollo, who was the god of the sun. A couple of examples of that are having curly hair, which the Buddha was not supposed to have. He was clean shaven on the top of his head like Buddhist monks. And they also have a halo around the Buddha's head, which is regarded as having come from a depiction of the sun, a solar disk, because Apollo was god of the sun. And this also may have been the way in which the halo entered into Christianity as a representation of a saintly or holy status. We can also see depictions of Atlas, a titan or giant from ancient Greek religion, and other Greek gods in early Buddhist iconography. We also see some Buddhist gods depicted using the form or iconography of Greek gods. For example, Vajrapani, who's a protector of the Buddha, could be depicted as Hercules. And Haritri, who's an Indian goddess of childbirth and protecting children, could be depicted as Tyche or Tuke, the ancient Greek goddess of fortune. You can see some of this imagery apparently influenced sculptures of the Mauryas and just some other early Hindu iconography from the first few centuries BCE and the first few centuries CE as well. The picture on the right of a seated Buddha is actually from a later period, so this would have been towards the end of the Kushan Empire. The sculpture has been dated from around 300 to 500 CE, but it still shows a strong Greek influence in the solar disk around the head, the curly hair, and also the way that the clothing is depicted with the very characteristic drapery. Another example of very typically Hindu iconography is depicting gods or goddesses with multiple arms or multiple heads. We can see this from the Gupta period and after. The Guptas were a dynasty of kings who ruled over large parts of India from around 300 to around 550 CE. So an example of an early icon that has this multiple arms feature is an icon or murti of Durga. This one is from South India, from the modern state of Karnataka, from the 6th century CE. You can see she has multiple arms. It looks like she has her typical 8 arms. And we can also see another example of this from North India, the Shiva Trimurti, or depiction of Shiva with 3 heads. This comes from the Elephanta caves and dates to around 550 CE. So that would have been towards the end of the Gupta period. And this shows you that Shiva is sometimes depicted as having 3 heads. And then after the first few centuries CE, we see it very common in Hindu icons to have multiple arms or heads. So the multiple arms may symbolize the great power of gods or goddesses. They can manifest in multiple ways, or they're omnipresent all throughout the universe. And the multiple heads may be symbols of great knowledge or wisdom. Another characteristic of Hindu iconography is theriomorphic imagery. Theriomorphic means animal shaped. It's typical for Hindu gods or other spirits to have just part of their body be animal and the rest be human. An early example of this is the god Ganesha, who has an elephant head. There's an early icon of him that survives, or did survive until recently, in Kabul, Afghanistan, that dates to the 5th century CE. You can see that in the picture on the right. And it's also common to depict gods not as being partly animal in form, but as using animals as mounts or vahanas. So an example of this is the goddess Durga, who rides a tiger or lion. An early depiction of this from Tamil Nadu in southeast India, you can see on the right from 6th century CE. You also see on the right side of this image, she is fighting the buffalo-headed demon. And in this particular icon, he looks like a minotaur. He has the head of a buffalo, similar to the Greek mythological monster of the minotaur, which had the head of a bull. So it's possible that originally the animals themselves were used as symbols of the gods or goddesses, but at least at a certain point, the gods would be depicted as riding the animals. For example, Brahma, the god of creation, rides a swan, and Shiva rides a bull. Another very distinctive aspect of Hindu iconography is the Lingam and the Yoni. The Lingam is a cylinder or pillar, often made of stone. It's first and foremost a symbol of the god Shiva, and also of masculine or male divine power in general. Some of the early examples of lingams actually look like a human penis or phallus, and so it is connected with masculinity, but it's mainly just depicted abstractly nowadays as a stone cylinder. You can even see in these ancient examples of lingams that they're quite abstract. They look like short pillars. The one on the far right is from the Kushan period, and it dates to around 30 to 375 CE. It also has depicted a head of Shiva. Later lingams will often be just purely abstract, like the one you can see in the picture on the left from Bhattavalinga Temple, and that dates to around 15th century CE. A Shiva lingam is often paired with a yoni, which can be a flat slab of stone, either in square or circular shape. This is a symbol of Shakti, or female divine power. You'll notice in the left side, the left picture of the Shiva lingam, that the lingam is placed on a circular yoni, and there's also on the far right of that a kind of trough that can drain the area around the lingam. So it's common to give offerings to a lingam by pouring them on the top. They will then pool around the base of the pillar, and then there can be a kind of channel for them to exit the lingam and yoni. Another interesting aspect of Hindu iconography is that there are some anthropomorphic or human-shaped depictions of gods that are quite abstract. And this appears to be a separate iconographical lineage that wasn't greatly influenced by things such as the ancient Mauryas or the ancient Greco-Buddhist kings, or even the ancient icons of South India like you find in the Chola Empire. An example is depictions of Juggernaut, who's often regarded as an incarnation of Vishnu. You can see in the picture on the right, it looks like a very stylized human face. And this is one of the most important icons of Lord Juggernaut. Another influence on Hindu iconography was that of Tantric Hinduism. So one of the distinctive aspects is having fearsome or gruesome deities, like Bhairava or the Matrikas, the mother goddesses. And these are often depicted with a necklace of human heads, or a garland or belt of severed arms. And this is not supposed to be depicting, murder of humans or something really evil. This is regarded as a depiction of a destructive aspect of gods and goddesses insofar as they destroy the ego, they destroy ignorance, they destroy delusion. And the garlands of heads and arms are regarded as being souvenirs of demons that they've defeated. There's also a use of kind of gruesome iconography of human skulls or skeletons that can be used in Tantra as reminders of the mortality of the body. So you should not be attached to the human body. You should rather identify with your true self or soul, which can be united with God. Another really important aspect of Tantric iconography are the yantras. These are abstract geometric designs. They often show bilateral symmetry, as the example here, the Sri Yantra. This is associated with a Tantric mother goddess. Now, these can be used just as decorations. You can find them that way in Hindu temples. They're also used as aids for visualization meditation. The Sri Yantra is often interpreted just as a kind of symbolic expression of liberated or enlightened consciousness as well. So let's look at a particular example of an icon. This is Shivanataraja, which is depicting Shiva as the king of the dance. Now, there are multiple icons that have this general form, but they tend to follow a specific pattern. In Hindu iconography, it's common for every gesture and every aspect of the image to have symbolic meaning. So in this image, Shiva has 4 arms and 2 legs and 1 head. He's surrounded by a circle of flame, which symbolizes the destruction of the universe that takes part as part of the cosmic cycle that's governed by Shiva. So Shiva's first right arm holds a small drum. This symbolizes the divine sound of creation, which can also be thought of as the mantra Om that's being constantly broadcast by Shiva or Brahman, the supreme being, throughout the universe. This initiates but also sustains the creation. The second right arm is gesturing a protection mudra, or a gesture of fear not and of protection. You see this very commonly both on Hindu and on Buddhist icons when the god or being depicted is regarded as a giver of protection. The right leg of Shiva is standing on Apasmara, who's a dwarf demon that symbolizes ignorance and delusion. So this is Shiva trampling on ignorance. The first left arm of Shiva holds a flame, and that once again symbolizes the destruction of the universe presided over by Shiva, and specifically the destruction of the mortal aspect of the universe, the part that's not godlike and eternal. So that's the part that you shouldn't be attached to anyway. The fire here can also represent the sacrifice of Vedic rituals. So the destruction of things in fire is actually regarded as a potential offering you can make to Shiva or to God. The second left arm gestures downward to the raised left leg. And this left leg, because it is raised up from off the ground, symbolizes moksha or liberation. So that should be the goal of any worshiper of Shiva, liberating your consciousness from attachment to the world and finding something eternal and free. Music is very important in Hinduism. So there's a very close connection between the history of Indian classical music and the Hindu religion. The words Gandharva Veda is used for the traditional knowledge of music and dance. Veda is the Hindu scripture, but it can also be used in a wider sense to refer to any area of knowledge. A Gandharva is a heavenly musician, similar to a god or heavenly spirit like the angels in Christianity or Islam. So there's many different aspects to classical Indian music. One common feature is having a raga or melody that is used as the basis for improvisation. So music is often performed by groups or troops of performers, and there'll be one leader who will kind of by his or her example set the pattern that can then be riffed off of improvisationally by the other members of the troupe. It's often been compared to modern American jazz music in terms of improvising around a melody. And rhythm and beat is also very important to Indian music. The rhythm will change over the course of the song. So an example of specifically religious music is a bhajan, or devotional song. A famous modern singer of bhajans is Kaushiki Chakrabarti. You can see in the picture on the right. What's interesting, or one of the things interesting about Hindu bhajans, is that they're often quite popular. They overlap with popular music, so there's a real continuity between the tradition of Indian classical music and song and modern Indian pop music as well. It's more common for modern Hindus to listen to classical music than it is, for example, for Westerners to listen to European or American or other Western classical music. And finally, dance, or Natya, is very important in Hinduism. There's an ancient text called the Natya Shastra, written in Sanskrit, from around 200 BCE to 200 CE in terms of the date of composition. This text is still used today by modern practitioners of classical Indian dance. It distinguishes, for example, between both classical and folk dance, so the kind of fine art or classical dance. This would be the sort of thing patronized by kings or in large temples, versus the folk dances that would be done by common people. The Natya Shastra also has a whole aesthetic philosophy, or a philosophy of artistic expression and experience. One important element of this aesthetic philosophy is the concept of rasa. Literally, rasa means taste. It can also be translated as essence. So it could be used to describe the tastes or flavors of food, but in the context of dance or art, it means the essence of an emotion that can be experienced by an audience when they see something depicted in music, dance, or another fine art. So according to the Natya Shastra, when you experience the essence of an emotion, this can cause you to reflect on your own consciousness, and it can have moral and spiritual implications to it. An example of how this works is if you see a person suffering in a dance, a song, or some other performance art or other artistic depiction. When you are experiencing as an audience member the suffering of the character, you're not getting enjoyment out of it because you're delighting in their suffering. Instead, it's causing a more refined emotion to occur in your own mind. Typically, if you're getting aesthetic appreciation out of this work of art, it's because you're experiencing compassion for that suffering. And if you reflect on that compassion, that connection to another human being, that can give you insight into morality and spirituality. An example of a classical Indian school of dance is Bharatanatyam. The picture on the right shows a modern dancer of Bharatanatyam. This was developed in temples, Hindu temples in South India. And it would have been practiced primarily by girls, dancing girls, who were associated with a particular temple. And sometimes they could be regarded as part of the clergy, or at least part of the religious establishment. They weren't Brahmins, but they were set apart from the rest of society. Nowadays, anyone can learn classical dance. You don't have to be affiliated with or performing at a specific temple. But Bharatanatyam is still quite popular, and it shows you the living tradition of Hindu fine arts and how they're quite integrated with modern Indian culture. So that's all for this video. In the next video, we're going to look at modern Hinduism, which is the history of Hinduism from around 1800 to the present.